Mr. Ambassador, I want to start with Russian relations because right now there is a Russian offshore supply vessel making its way from St. Petersburg to the port of Mukran in Germany, and it has severe implications for the construction of Nord Stream 2. German Chancellor Angela Merkel has said just within the last several days that she is open now to rethinking that Nord Stream 2 pipeline. I want to get your reaction to these developments.
Well, thanks, Kevin. Look, this is a serious issue for America and American policy. I want to make clear that we've always told the Germans and our European partners that Nord Stream 1 is a part of a good diversification for the German energy market and for the European energy market. But Nord Stream 2 goes too far, and that is what the European Parliament has said. So America joins with the rest of Europe in saying to the Germans, Nord Stream 2 goes too far in light of all of the issues that we see from Russia. This is the reason why America has very strong sanctions on Russia, but we're also keeping the door open to talk, to try to change the behavior of the Russians. As you say, this latest development is very concerning to the United States. And we also have noted and are trying to work with the Germans as much as possible because Angela Merkel's own party, the Christian Democrats, are also having a lot of angst. We see individuals within the CDU saying to the Chancellor, now is not the time, we should probably put this whole project on ice. We think that's a good idea. The U.S. Senate in Washington, D.C. thinks that's a good idea. The European Parliament thinks this is a good idea. So we hope that the German government will actually be multilateral and listen to their multilateral Western partners.
Well, that's what I want to follow up on, because so many of the conversations that I have with Democrats in geopolitical circles, they make the argument that a Democratic administration would take a much more multilateral approach. But what I'm hearing from you is that there have been instances where the Trump administration has sought to use, albeit with an aggressive rhetorical tone, but has still sought to use multilateralism.
Yeah, it's such a great question, Kevin. Thank you for asking it, because the reality is that we have a fundamentally different worldview than Joe Biden. Joe Biden has the idea that America comes up with one policy position and we put it into the UN Security Council mixer or the European government mixer, and it all gets blended up and watered down, and it becomes the lowest common denominator of a policy. We don't view multilateralism like that. What we view is that we fight for American policy, what's best for American national security, and then we look for partners. We look for regional alliances. That doesn't mean that you have to go to the UN Security Council and allow them to water down your policy, or go to the EU in Brussels and cut the policy in half, America versus the EU, and we somehow meet in a watered down version where nobody agrees. That's the old way of looking at consensus, and we feel that America's responsibility is to the American people first. And America alone doesn't mean, America first doesn't mean America alone. America first means that we take the American people's safety and prosperity first, and then we try to form alliances around that. So we're going to remake regional alliances. The perfect example is Nord Stream 2, where our Nord Stream 2 policy, rejected by the German government, is actually celebrated by the European Parliament. And so we're going to work very hard to be multilateral with a strong U.S. foreign policy.
I want to talk about China because just recently the World Trade Organization, something that President Trump has been increasingly critical of, has declared that some of the tariffs that have been imposed by the United States on China don't fall in line with WTO guidelines. How does the Trump administration deal with global institutions like the WTO while also trying to take a more aggressive stance with Beijing?
So I would say a couple of points there, Kevin. One, look at the example that the Trump administration has tried to use with the United Nations, which is Some programs at the UN are very good, some are not. We're trying to get rid of the ones that are not. We believe that when you reform organizations, there's an argument to be made that you believe in those organizations rather than ignore them and let them become adrift. It's been 20 years since China has been put into the WTO. When we originally envisioned China going into the WTO, we did it because we thought that in a couple of years, say 4 or 5 at the most, China would begin to act like a Western-style capitalistic country. They would at least move in that direction. We didn't think that overnight that the Chinese would start pushing capitalism, but we didn't think that 20 years later that we would have the problems that we have in Hong Kong, that we would still have Chinese stealing of intellectual property, that we still would have the Chinese having an economy that's based off taking other ideas and just replicating them and ignoring the rule of law and human rights. And so we think that it's not too much to say that having the Chinese in the WTO has been a disaster. I don't think that they should be a part of the WTO. They've demonstrated over 20 years that they are not willing to move in the direction that the WTO wants to, which is capitalism. And so I think that we are going to create organizations like the new USMCA trade agreement, where there are provisions in there of problem solving outside of the WTO, because we are admitting to the world that the WTO is failing.
You know, and lastly, Middle East front and center. We've seen the role that Israel has played in normalizing relations with now 2 Gulf Arab states. And then, of course, the recent developments that you, of course, sir, were front and center for with regards to Kosovo and Serbia, Israel playing a key role in that agreement as well. What role has Iran factored into in terms of bringing some of these traditionally very combative areas and regions to working together?
Well, the Americans and the Europeans have had the same goal with Iran, which is to deny them a nuclear weapon. We've had fundamentally different tactics. The Europeans want this watered-down consensus and status quo dealing with Iran. The Americans, and specifically the Trump administration, has said that doesn't work. We need to try something different. I think today's historic signing of peace deals shows that a more aggressive Trump administration approach is working. We would still be in this status quo foreign policy establishment muck if it was not for Donald Trump. He's challenged the Europeans to think differently. I also will note that the Europeans have not been supportive of our strategy in the Middle East. And we are seeing today at the White House historic signings because we ignored those tactics in dealing with Iran. We've played a very tough diplomatic game when it comes to Iran. And look what's happened. You have Sunni nations, you have Arab governments who are coming forward to say, let's do something different. Let's sign these historic peace agreements. I will also just add quickly, it's the same issue with Kosovo, Serbia. We have economic normalization that has been signed, and yet this kind of old way of thinking, the UN way of thinking, the European way of thinking, was to continue pushing on the political front of Kosovo, Serbia. We've been banging our head against the wall for 20 years there. And so now we have economic normalization. We're quite pleased.